What did Winston Churchill truly say when Dwight Eisenhower made the most controversial decision of the Second World War, a choice that would determine not only the fate of millions but the very shape of Europe for generations to come? On the cold morning of January 27, 1944, inside a smoke-filled room at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in London, the British Prime Minister sat across from the Supreme Allied Commander, his face flushed with barely contained fury, his legendary cigar trembling between his fingers as he listened to words he had dreaded for months. Eisenhower had just informed him that the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe would follow the American plan, a direct assault across the English Channel into Normandy, rather than Churchill's preferred Mediterranean strategy, which called for striking through the Balkans and what he ominously called the soft underbelly of Europe. The tension in that room was suffocating. Two titans of the Allied cause locked in a battle of wills that had been brewing since the Tehran Conference 3 months earlier, where Joseph Stalin had sided decisively with the American position, leaving Churchill isolated and outnumbered. This was not merely a tactical disagreement about beaches and battlefields, it was a clash of imperial visions, a struggle over whether Britain or America would chart the course of the post-war world, and whether Soviet influence would extend deep into Central Europe or be contained at the gates of the Reich. Churchill understood with crystal clarity that once the Americans committed to their cross-channel invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, the British Empire's influence over grand strategy would effectively end, and with it, 3 centuries of British dominance over European affairs would slip irretrievably into history. The room fell silent as Eisenhower finished speaking, his calm, methodical Kansas voice a stark contrast to Churchill's Edwardian eloquence, and in that silence hung the weight of empires rising and falling, of old orders giving way to new, of a world that would never be the same again. Churchill rose from his chair, his considerable bulk seeming even more imposing in the dim light filtering through the blackout curtains, and what he said next would reveal not just his immediate reaction, but his profound understanding of what this decision truly meant for Britain, for Europe, and for the balance of power that would define the remainder of the 20th century. Before we continue with Churchill's explosive response and the dramatic confrontation that followed, if you're fascinated by these pivotal moments when leaders made decisions that changed history forever, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button to help others discover these untold stories. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand how the world we live in today was forged in rooms like this one. And leave a comment telling us what surprises you most about this clash between Churchill and Eisenhower, because your engagement keeps these vital historical lessons alive for everyone. Churchill's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and dangerous, edged with a bitterness that shocked even those who knew him well, and he began not with congratulations or expressions of alliance solidarity, but with a historical lecture that cut to the heart of his objections, reminding everyone present that Britain had been fighting Hitler since September 1939, that British cities had burned under the Blitz while America watched from across the Atlantic, that British and Commonwealth forces had held the line in North Africa, Greece, and Crete when the outcome hung by a thread. He invoked the names of British generals who had died in the Mediterranean theater, spoke of the blood spilled at El Alamein under Bernard Montgomery in November 1942, referenced the hard-won victories in Sicily and the brutal Italian campaign that was still grinding forward through the mountains south of Rome, where Allied forces under Harold Alexander faced the Wehrmacht across the Gustav Line and the seemingly impregnable defenses of Monte Cassino. The Prime Minister's strategic vision had always looked toward Vienna and Prague, toward a thrust through Italy and into the Ljubljana Gap that would carry Allied armies into Austria and Czechoslovakia before the Soviet Red Army could reach those ancient capitals, thereby preventing what he feared most, a communist-dominated Eastern Europe that would become Stalin's empire. Churchill had argued this position relentlessly at Casablanca in January 1943, where he had pushed for expanding Mediterranean operations, and again at the First Quebec Conference in August 1943, where American military planners, led by General George Marshall, had grown increasingly insistent on the direct approach across the Channel. At Tehran in late November 1943, when the Big Three, Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Stalin, met for the first time together in the Soviet embassy compound in Iran, the Prime Minister had found himself outmaneuvered by an emerging alliance between the American president and the Soviet dictator, both of whom wanted Overlord launched in the spring of 1944 with no further delays. Stalin had been blunt to the point of rudeness, declaring that the Red Army had been bleeding for years on the Eastern Front, while the Western Allies engaged in what he dismissively called mere diversions in the Mediterranean, and that a second front in France was not only necessary but long overdue. Roosevelt, increasingly convinced by his military advisors and perhaps influenced by his declining health, which would claim his life just 15 months later in April 1945, had sided with Stalin, promising the Soviet leader that Overlord would proceed as planned and that a commander would be named within days. Churchill had returned to London from Tehran in early December 1943, exhausted, ill with pneumonia that nearly killed him, and deeply disturbed by what he had witnessed, the clear shift in power from London to Washington and Moscow, the emergence of a bipolar world in which Britain would be at best a junior partner. Now, standing before Eisenhower on that January morning, all those frustrations, all those fears about Britain's diminishing role and Soviet expansion, poured forth in a torrent of eloquence and barely suppressed rage, as Churchill painted a vivid picture of Red Army tanks rolling through Warsaw, Budapest, and Vienna unopposed while American and British forces were still fighting their way through the hedgerows of Normandy. Eisenhower listened with his characteristic patience, but his face betrayed no hint of reconsideration, for he had his orders from Washington, from Roosevelt, from Marshall, and from the combined weight of American military and industrial power that now dwarfed Britain's exhausted resources after nearly 5 years of total war. The Supreme Commander's position was unassailable, and both men knew it, though neither wished to acknowledge the fundamental power shift that this military decision represented. Eisenhower respected Churchill enormously, admired his courage and his war leadership, had worked closely with him since arriving in London in June 1942, and understood the historical burden the Prime Minister carried. But the American general was also keenly aware that the United States was now providing the majority of men, ships, aircraft, and supplies for the Allied war effort in the West, and that this material reality gave Washington the decisive voice in strategic planning. The statistics were overwhelming and undeniable. American factories were producing aircraft at a rate of more than 8,000 per month by early 1944. The United States Army had grown from barely 200,000 men in 1939 to more than 8 million in uniform by 1944. And American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, turning the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic that had threatened Britain's very survival. Britain, by contrast, was financially exhausted, dependent on American Lend-Lease aid that now exceeded $27 billion, facing severe manpower shortages that made every casualty a strategic concern, and increasingly aware that the empire it had controlled for centuries was beginning to fracture, with independence movements gaining strength in India, where Gandhi and Nehru were demanding freedom, and across Africa and Asia. Eisenhower explained, in his calm and methodical way, that Operation Overlord had been in planning since 1943, that an enormous infrastructure had been built in southern England to support the invasion, including countless airfields, supply depots, and training facilities, that more than 2 million American soldiers would be in Britain by D-Day, and that the invasion fleet was already being assembled, the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare, requiring more than 5,000 ships and landing craft. He reminded Churchill that the combined chiefs of staff had approved this plan, that every detail from artificial harbors called mulberries to the massive deception operation known as Fortitude had been designed around a Normandy landing, and that postponing or canceling Overlord now would be catastrophic for Allied morale and credibility. The general also pointed out, though more tactfully than Stalin had done, that the Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of the fighting against Nazi Germany, with the Red Army engaging more than 200 Wehrmacht divisions on the Eastern Front, suffering casualties in the millions, and steadily pushing westward after the great victory at Stalingrad in February 1943 and the massive tank battle at Kursk in July 1943, and that Stalin's patience with delays in opening a second front was exhausted. Churchill knew all this, of course. His brilliant mind grasped every military, political, and logistical dimension of the situation, but knowing and accepting were different things, and what troubled him most was not the military logic of Overlord but its political consequences. The fact that by the time Allied forces fought their way across France and into Germany, the Red Army would already control Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and much of Czechoslovakia, creating precisely the Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe he had warned against. The conversation between Churchill and Eisenhower on that January day stretched for hours, moving from the formal meeting room to Churchill's personal study, where maps of Europe covered every wall and the smell of brandy and cigar smoke created an atmosphere thick with history and consequence. The Prime Minister tried every argument in his formidable arsenal, appealing to strategic logic, historical precedent, imperial interests, and the lessons of the First World War, when Allied forces had been bled white in the trenches of France and Belgium while alternative approaches were neglected. He reminded Eisenhower of the Gallipoli campaign of 1915, an attempt to outflank the Central Powers through Turkey that had ended in disaster, yes, but the principle of avoiding frontal assaults in favor of indirect approaches remained sound in Churchill's mind, even if that particular operation had been poorly executed. He spoke of the opportunities that would be lost if Allied forces did not reach Vienna and Prague first, painted vivid scenarios of a divided Europe with an iron curtain, a phrase he would later make famous in his speech at Fulton, Missouri in March 1946, descending across the continent from the Baltic to the Adriatic. Churchill even suggested compromise positions. Perhaps Overlord could be delayed a few months to allow for greater exploitation of success in Italy, or perhaps Allied forces could conduct simultaneous operations in southern France, Operation Anvil, which was indeed planned for August 1944, to complement the Mediterranean strategy. But Eisenhower remained unmoved, not from stubbornness or lack of imagination, but because he understood that the decision had already been made at the highest levels of Allied leadership, that Roosevelt had effectively promised Stalin at Tehran that Overlord would go forward in May 1944, that the entire American military establishment was committed to this course, and that nothing short of a catastrophic change in circumstances would alter it now. The Supreme Commander also knew something that Churchill perhaps did not fully appreciate, that American public opinion and American political will for the war effort depended on seeing decisive action in Western Europe, not continued fighting in what many Americans viewed as British imperial interests in the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and the Middle East. As afternoon turned to evening on that winter day, and the conversation circled back repeatedly to the same fundamental disagreements, both men recognized that they had reached an impasse that could not be bridged by eloquence or friendship, an impasse rooted in the hard realities of power, resources, and the shifting balance of world influence from the British Empire to the American Republic and the Soviet Union. Churchill finally fell silent, his legendary energy depleted, his usually ruddy face pale and drawn, and in that silence Eisenhower saw not just a frustrated war leader but something more poignant, a man watching the world he had known, the British-led world order of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, passing into history before his eyes, and understanding that all his genius, all his courage, all his magnificent oratory could not arrest that tide. The formal announcement came on February 12, 1944, when General Dwight D. Eisenhower was officially designated Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force for Operation Overlord, though the decision had effectively been made weeks earlier, and Churchill had no choice but to accept it publicly with grace while privately continuing to harbor deep reservations. The preparations for D-Day accelerated through the spring of 1944, with Eisenhower establishing his headquarters at Southwick House near Portsmouth, coordinating the efforts of British, American, Canadian, and Free French forces, while dealing with the enormous egos and competing visions of subordinate commanders like Bernard Montgomery, who would lead the ground forces for the initial assault, George Patton, who was being held in reserve and used as part of the deception plan, and Omar Bradley, who would command the American First Army. Churchill remained involved in planning, attended countless meetings, visited training exercises, and inspected troops preparing for the invasion, but the fundamental strategic direction was now set, and his influence, while still considerable on tactical matters and political issues, had been decisively curtailed on the grand strategic questions. The Prime Minister did score one significant victory in these months, insisting that British forces must play a major role in the invasion and not be relegated to supporting status, ensuring that Montgomery commanded the ground forces initially and that British and Canadian troops would land on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches alongside Americans landing at Utah and Omaha. He also continued to push for maintaining pressure in Italy, where Allied forces finally broke through the Gustav Line in May 1944, entered Rome on June 4, just 2 days before D-Day, and pursued the German forces northward, though never with the resources Churchill believed necessary to achieve his vision of reaching Austria and the Balkans. Behind the scenes, Churchill's relationship with Roosevelt became increasingly strained over strategic issues, though both leaders maintained public unity, understanding that any visible split between London and Washington would be catastrophic for the alliance and a gift to Nazi propaganda. The President, who had been Churchill's crucial supporter and friend since before Pearl Harbor, who had provided the Lend-Lease aid that kept Britain fighting in 1941, who had agreed to a Germany First strategy despite pressure to focus on Japan after December 7, 1941, was now clearly prioritizing his relationship with Stalin and his own military advisors over British strategic preferences. Roosevelt's motives were complex, partly driven by genuine strategic calculation that a cross-channel invasion was the fastest way to defeat Germany, partly by his military advisors' consistent arguments for Overlord, partly by his desire to maintain good relations with Stalin and ensure Soviet entry into the war against Japan, and partly perhaps by a vision of post-war international order centered on cooperation between Washington and Moscow rather than on the old European balance of power system that had failed so catastrophically twice in one generation. Churchill understood all these motivations and fought against them when he could, but by the spring of 1944, the die was cast, and the Prime Minister could only watch, participate, and hope that his darkest fears about Soviet expansion would somehow prove unfounded, though his instincts and historical knowledge told him otherwise. If you're still watching this remarkable story of how personal conflicts between leaders shaped the course of history and the world we inherited, this is exactly the moment to pause and take action. Subscribe to this channel immediately because we bring you these deep dives into the pivotal decisions that changed everything. Smash that like button to ensure this content reaches the widest possible audience who needs to understand how our current geopolitical reality was forged. Share this video with friends, family, colleagues, anyone who cares about history and leadership and the consequences of the choices made in rooms where maps cover the walls and the fate of millions hangs in the balance. And drop a comment right now telling us which aspect of this Churchill-Eisenhower confrontation you found most revealing or what detail you never knew before. Because your engagement directly determines whether these crucial historical lessons survive and spread or disappear into the algorithm's void. The night before D-Day, June 5, 1944, Churchill was at Southwick House with Eisenhower and the senior commanders as they made the final decision to launch the invasion despite marginal weather conditions, with the meteorologist group Captain James Stagg predicting a brief window of slightly improved weather on June 6 before conditions deteriorated again. The tension in that room was unbearable, the weight of responsibility almost physical, as Eisenhower listened to final reports, consulted with his commanders, and then made the decision that would commit more than 150,000 men to cross the English Channel and assault Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the massive system of fortifications, obstacles, and defenders that the Germans had built along the coast of occupied France. Churchill wanted desperately to cross the Channel with the invasion forces, to be present on the beaches, to witness this moment he had worked toward for 5 years despite his reservations about the strategic plan, but King George VI, after hearing of the Prime Minister's intention, informed Churchill that if the Prime Minister was going to Normandy on D-Day, then the King would go as well, forcing Churchill to back down since he could not possibly allow the monarch to take such a risk. In the early hours of June 6, as American, British, and Canadian paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines and the vast armada crossed the Channel toward the beaches, Churchill was in London, pacing, smoking, receiving reports, unable to sleep, knowing that the success or failure of this operation would determine not only the war's outcome but the entire shape of the post-war world. The landing succeeded, though at terrible cost, especially at Omaha Beach where American forces faced withering fire and nearly failed to secure the beachhead, and within days it was clear that Overlord had achieved strategic surprise despite German expectations of an invasion, and that Allied forces were ashore in France to stay. Churchill visited Normandy on June 12, 6 days after D-Day, landing on one of the British beaches and touring the expanding beachhead, his emotions a complex mixture of pride in Allied achievement, relief that the landings had succeeded, and renewed concern about the timeline for reaching Germany and the inevitable race with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The Prime Minister's fears about the post-war settlement were reinforced in July 1944 when the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, the massive offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center, liberated Minsk and much of Belorussia, and carried Soviet forces to the gates of Warsaw by early August, raising the terrible question of what would happen when the Polish Home Army rose against the German occupiers and Stalin chose to halt his forces on the east bank of the Vistula River and watch as the Germans crushed the uprising. Churchill was appalled by the Warsaw Uprising tragedy that unfolded in August and September 1944, tried desperately to organize aid for the Polish fighters, pleaded with Stalin to allow Allied aircraft to use Soviet airfields to drop supplies, and was forced to watch helplessly as the Home Army was destroyed and Warsaw reduced to rubble, a preview of the Soviet domination of Poland that would last for 45 years. The strategic consequences of the American plan that Eisenhower had chosen became increasingly clear through the autumn of 1944 as Allied forces liberated France, with Paris freed on August 25 by French forces under General Philippe Leclerc and American units under General Leonard Gero, but then ran into supply difficulties and fierce German resistance that prevented a quick thrust into Germany. Operation Market Garden in September 1944, Montgomery's ambitious attempt to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands and open a route into Germany's industrial heartland, ended in failure at Arnhem, demonstrating that the Germans were far from defeated and that the war would continue into 1945, giving the Red Army additional months to advance westward. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, after the hard winter fighting that included the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 through January 1945, where German forces launched a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes that shocked Allied commanders and required weeks to contain, Soviet forces had already overrun Poland, Hungary, most of Czechoslovakia, and were fighting in the streets of Berlin. Churchill attended the Yalta Conference in February 1945, meeting with Roosevelt and Stalin in the Crimea to discuss post-war arrangements, and found himself once again outnumbered and outpositioned, with a dying Roosevelt, who had only weeks to live, making concessions to Stalin on Polish borders, German reparations, and the composition of post-war Eastern European governments that Churchill believed would consign millions to communist dictatorship. The Prime Minister fought hard at Yalta for Polish independence, for free elections in liberated countries, for Allied access to Eastern European capitals, but the reality was that Soviet forces occupied these territories, that Western Allied forces were still fighting to reach the Elbe River in Germany, and that Stalin held all the cards that mattered, physical control of the ground. By April 1945, as American and British forces advanced into Germany from the west and Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east, the question arose whether Western forces should race for Berlin and Prague, or halt at the Elbe and allow the Soviets to take the German capital as had been agreed at Yalta. Eisenhower, in a controversial decision that Churchill bitterly opposed, chose to halt at the Elbe, arguing that Berlin and Prague were in the agreed Soviet occupation zones, that taking these cities would cost tens of thousands of Allied casualties for no strategic gain, and that maintaining good relations with the Soviet Union was more important than symbolic victories. Churchill was furious, sent angry messages to Eisenhower and to the new American President Harry Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt after his death on April 12, arguing that Allied forces should push as far east as possible before the final German surrender to ensure the strongest possible negotiating position with Stalin, but once again he was overruled. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender, but the map of occupied Europe reflected precisely what Churchill had feared in that January 1944 meeting with Eisenhower. Soviet forces controlled everything east of a line running roughly from Lübeck on the Baltic through the middle of Germany to Trieste on the Adriatic. Western Allied forces held Western Europe, and the Iron Curtain that would divide the continent for the next 44 years was already descending. Churchill's warnings about Soviet intentions and the strategic consequences of the Overlord Plan proved prescient in the months and years following Germany's defeat, as Stalin consolidated communist control over Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, creating a Soviet empire in Eastern Europe that would last until 1989. The Prime Minister had been voted out of office in July 1945, in a stunning election defeat just 2 months after victory in Europe, but he remained active in politics and became one of the first Western leaders to publicly warn about Soviet expansionism, delivering his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri on March 5, 1946, where he declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, and warning that communist parties or fifth columns everywhere constitute a growing challenge and peril to Christian civilization. The speech was controversial at the time, with many Americans and Britons still hoping for continued cooperation with the Soviet Union, but events quickly vindicated Churchill's analysis as Stalin refused to withdraw Soviet forces from Iran, supported communist insurgencies in Greece and Turkey, blockaded Berlin in 1948, and detonated the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb in 1949. As we reach the end of this remarkable story of leadership, strategy, and historical consequence, if you found value in understanding how Churchill's explosive reaction to Eisenhower's decision revealed the deeper currents shaping our world, then take action right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss these crucial historical insights. Hit that like button to help this content overcome the algorithm and reach everyone who needs to understand how great decisions are made under pressure. Share this video immediately with anyone interested in leadership, history, or the moments when the course of civilization pivots on individual choices, and leave a comment below about which element of this Churchill-Eisenhower confrontation surprised you most or what lesson from their clash remains relevant today. Because your engagement ensures these vital stories continue to illuminate the present through the lens of the past.